This installment on the Morgenthau Plan deals with Joint Chiefs of Staff Directive 1067, referred to as JCS 1067. This was the directive issued to the military governors of the U.S. zone of occupied Germany. It was drafted by adherents of the Morgenthau Plan. The original draft was created on the 22nd of September prior to President Roosevelt's apparent rejection of the Morgenthau Plan. On April 26th, the second major revision of the directive was approved by the Cabinet Committee and sent to the Joint Chiefs of Staff for clearance. According to historian John Morton Bloom, this was, quote, very close to Morgenthau's position. John Snell noted that this revision, quote, met with the warm approval of the Treasury officials. On April 28th, a draft of JCS 1067 was sent to the Joint Chiefs of Staff to General Eisenhower. President Truman signed this revised version of 1067 on May 10, 1945. Morgenthau considered this, quote, a big day for the Treasury. He also hoped, quote, somebody doesn't recognize it as the Morgenthau Plan. The approved directive was issued on May 14th. It was distributed to key personnel on May 21st, classified as top secret. It would retain that top secret designation until October 17, 1945, when it was released by the State Department. One of the most important goals of the Treasury dealt with the standard of living to be maintained in occupied Germany. This was contained in Section 21 of the Directive, German Standard of Living. 21. You will estimate requirements of supplies necessary to prevent starvation and widespread disease or such unrest as would endanger the occupying forces. Such estimates will be based upon a program where the Germans are made responsible for providing for themselves out of their own work and resources. You will take all practical, economic, and police measures to assure that German resources are fully utilized and consumption held to a minimum. This section contained a passage from the original Basic Handbook that had so angered Morgenthau. It included the passage, German food and other supplies will be utilized for the German population to the minimum extent required to prevent disease and unrest. This sentence was modified to include, quote, as would endanger the occupying forces. The officials who revised the original draft of 1067 were lawyers, and the inclusion of this addition was not accidental or superfluous. It was meant to be interpreted as allowing starvation or widespread disease as long as it did not endanger the occupying forces. The intent of this original edition is revealed in a passage by historian John Backer. Quote, faced with two impossible alternatives, namely the administration of mass starvation under the aegis of the American flag or the open violation of military orders, they, General Clay, were obliged to move in a third direction traditionally unfamiliar to the military mind, namely a painstaking legal analysis of their orders. Mass starvation was the intent of these military orders, and its prevention would be, quote, open violation of military orders. President Truman signed JCS 1067 and sent it to General Eisenhower on 14 May. Morgenthau told Truman that he wanted to attend the Potsdam Conference scheduled for mid-July. The president informed him that he was needed in Washington, so Morgenthau threatened to resign if he was not permitted to attend the conference, and Truman accepted his resignation. Although President Truman disagreed with Morgenthau's philosophy on post-war planning, the policies Truman followed at Potsdam were based on 1067. According to German-American historian Hajo Holborn, all the general objectives contained in the American Post-Defeat Directive, 1067, reappear in the Potsdam Declaration, often enough couched in the same language. Morgenthau wrote in the New York Times, the New York Post, on November 24th, 1947, quote, "The Morgenthau Plan for Germany became part of the Potsdam Agreement, a solemn declaration of policy and undertaking for action signed by the United States of America, Great Britain, and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics." The report on the Tripartite Conference of Potsdam, August 2nd, 1945, contained the following passage dealing with reparations from Germany. In addition, number 4, in addition to the reparations to be taken by the USSR from its own zone of occupation, the USSR shall receive additionally from the Western Zone 15% of such usable and complete industrial capital equipment, in the first place from the metallurgical, chemical, and machine manufacturing industries, as is unnecessary for the German peacetime economy, should be removed from the Western Zone of Germany in exchange for an equivalent value of food, coal, potash, zinc, timber, clay products, petroleum products, and such other commodities as may be agreed upon. 10% of such industrial capital equipment as is unnecessary for the German peacetime economy and should be removed from the Western Zone to be transferred to the Soviet government on reparations account without payment or exchange of any kind in return. Was JCS 1067 the Morgenthau Plan? Conventional historians can honestly contend that it was not. JCS 1067 did not cover all of Germany, as the Morgenthau Plan did. There were significant proposals in the Morgenthau Plan that were not included in JCS 1067. For example, the provisions for slave labor. However, it cannot honestly be maintained that the Morgenthau Plan did not form the foundation of 1067. People involved in the negotiations saw this and commented on it at the time. The State Department's Walter Dorn wrote, "What is so striking about 1067 is not that it was a punitive document, it could not have been otherwise, but that it was an exclusively punitive document." He added that 1067 was largely a Treasury document. Economist E.F. Penrose recorded, "Naturally, the Treasury exerted a particularly strong influence on this section of the financial section of 1067. And as the financial administrators would be headed by officers who were really Treasury officials transferred temporarily to the Army in frequent communication with Mr. Morgenthau, financial policy was predestined to be, in its earliest stages at least, an instrument of revenge and not of reconstruction. American and British taxpayers are still paying for the consequences of this early major era of the peace." Stimson reread the document 2 years later and found it, quote, "a painfully negative document." James W. Riddleberger, the chief of the State Department's Division of Central European Affairs, described the document as substantially the same as drafted by the Treasury Department some months ago. General Clay, the future military governor, stated, "There was no doubt that JCS 1067 contemplated the Carthaginian peace which dominated our operations in Germany during the early months of the occupation." Finally, there are Morgenthau's comments on the redrafted version of 1067. Quote, "I feel all these documents are so far better than I had any hope for that I am perfectly willing to sit tight. They are completely satisfactory to me," unquote. Morgenthau's son agreed that the Morgenthau Plan was implanted in 1067, and it enjoyed a short afterlife. He wrote, in the summer of 1945, after Morgenthau's resignation, the Morgenthau Plan enjoyed a short afterlife, implanted in the regulations for administrating the military German occupation. Joint Chiefs of Staff, 1067. It was in part the handiwork of Morgenthau's former assistant, Colonel Bernard Bernstein, and other Treasury hands planted in Eisenhower's staff. However, without Morgenthau and his privileged Roosevelt connections, the elements of 1067 for enforcement of tough peace were ultimately ignored. Henry Morgenthau III contended that without his father's guidance, the directive was ignored. However, due to the large number of ex-Treasury officials working as civil affairs officers during the early stages of the occupation, the directive was frequently carried out to the letter. 1067 was not replaced by a new directive until July 11, 1947. This new directive, JCS 1779, directed the commanding general to consider it his task to lay the economic and educational basis for a sound German economy. There were several reasons for the eventual abandonment of 1067. With the increasing tensions between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union, Germany was now seen as a valuable prize in the East-West struggle. In July 1946, Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov declared at the Foreign Ministers' Conference in Paris that it would be a mistake to plan for Germany's agrarianization and destruction of its main industrial centers. Molotov claimed that the Soviet Union's purpose was not to destroy Germany, but to transform it into a democratic and peace-loving state. Louis Douglas, General Clay's financial advisor, commented upon seeing the draft directive of on April 16th that, quote, "This thing was assembled by economic idiots." Douglas' comments reflected the thinking of many critics of Morgenthau's design. William Draper, Clay's economic advisor, concluded that the directive made little sense. Douglas went on to say, "It makes no sense to forbid the most skilled workers in Europe from producing as much as they can for a continent which is desperately short of everything." Morgenthau's advisors, however, were not economic idiots. The Morgenthau Plan made a great deal of sense. Sir John Wheeler Bennett and Anthony Nichols recorded in their work on the post-war settlement, "The thought of Mr. Douglas and those who shared his views was that the Morgenthau thesis, and therefore 1067, was unpractical for reasons of geography and also undesirable since a vast pool of unemployed Germans would and did create a fertile field for communist propaganda in the heart of Europe. There was only one beneficiary of the Morgenthau Plan and its consequences. The beneficiary was the Soviet Union. Earl Zimke pointed out, in the spring of 1947, all of Western Europe was in an accelerating downward economic spiral. General George C. Marshall apparently concluded that this situation exactly suited the Soviet Union. Marshall concluded, "The patient is sinking while the doctor deliberates." This was where historians record events following the defeat of Nazi Germany. The U.S. defeated Germany and then proceeded to rebuild it with the Marshall Plan. The intervening years did not happen. That's it.